Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Movies After Midnight, where we talk about films that have been forgotten, snubbed, or otherwise denied the attention they deserve. We are back with the second episode of TokuTember. Evie's finally reviewing a movie again instead of just kind of going off in the background about it. I do want to address a couple things. Last episode, I said a couple things that were patently untrue, which nobody called me out on. But I've got to maintain my journalistic ethos. Is that ethos or logos? I don't. Anyway, basically, last episode I mentioned there was a new Kamen Rider that was a ninja. That is the character Kamen Rider Shinobi from a show from Kamen Rider ZO, which was I think last year's Rider, and he was getting a web series, which is why I thought he was a new Rider, because I hadn't watched all of ZO. The current show is actually Kamen Rider Saber, which is actually in its first episode or two as I'm recording this. So I just wanted to clarify that in case someone starts jumping me for it later. And that's topical because today we are talking about Kamen Rider the First. And again, I felt it only made sense to start off TokuTember with something to do with Kamen Rider because I think it's a very big brand franchise. Oh yeah, I brought my Good Luck Rider with me for this podcast. But I think Kamen Rider is a very big brand and franchise for in the Toku world. It's not as known in the West as, say, Godzilla or even Sentai by way of Power Rangers. But I think, again, that's kind of why I felt it necessary to talk about. And specifically, Kamen Rider the First is a film shot in 2005 to basically be a reimagining of the very first 1971 Kamen Rider series. I kind of broke down some of the history of that in our last episode, so I won't go into it again here. But basically, they took that story, and as kind of a tribute to the original, they made a movie that was basically a remake of the original series plot, and kind of gave it a modern spin. And a couple things, I guess, to sort of provide some context about history I didn't go into. The original Kamen Rider featured a character named... the idea is that this guy named Takeshi Hongo is a this promising kind of grad student who is kidnapped by an evil organization and made into this cyborg warrior, but he escapes before the sort of mind control can be applied. So he's this rogue agent all of a sudden who's the one person who's trying to stop this conspiratorial organization from taking over the world. And originally Hongo was played by Hiroshi Fujioka, who is maybe the most masculine man to have ever walked the face of this planet. If you're a game collector, you've probably seen the Segata Senshiro ads, and he's probably, again, more known over here for that than for Kamen Rider. I mean, I guess depending on who you talk to. His character as Hongo was very determined, very superheroic, manly man kind of character, and the first kind of reinterprets that, makes the character a little more I don't want to say sensitive, because I feel like that gives off the wrong vibe, but he's there's a lot more emotional storytelling as opposed to he's kind of Kazama Kiryu type character you see in the original show. And also, again, just for some history, Fujioka, for the first 13 episodes of Kamen Rider, did all his own stunts. I think it was 13, it might have been more. He did all his own stunts and ended up actually breaking his leg during one of the motorcycle stunts. And so to kind of cover this up, they used what footage they already had with him and had the Kamen Rider show up in costume a lot more and dubbed over someone else. And then until eventually they could phase in the second character, Hayato Ichimonji, who also got converted into a cyborg, but Hongo rescues him, and he sort of becomes the second Kamen Rider that took over until later after he had healed and kind of done some other stuff I'm forgetting the actor's name now. Hiroshi Fujioka came back, and so they were like the two Kamen Riders for a while, and that's kind of what this film deals with. It sort of retells not only Hongo's introduction, but his relationship with Ichimonji, and that's kind of, I think, both what that ties into what I think makes this film really cool and what I think makes it a little weird. So to kind of go over, we get a lot more. We start off with Hongo being this. We get a lot more of him as an academic, which we didn't really see as much in the show. It was very much an informed trait, and he's conducting some thesis basically about water crystals and this like innate life, and it's like a science thing, but it's the way it's approached is in this very like kind of romantic arts major kind of way, which is interesting. But we kind of get introduced to him through that, and it gets pretty into him getting kidnapped. This film is very fast paced, and I would argue sometimes it's almost maybe a little too fast at time, or at least at the very start, because I think they wanted to really get right into the idea of the Kamen Rider and everything without wasting too much time on stuff that wasn't that, so to speak. It's tone-wise, the first is a lot. It's a little darker and a little more. It's a little more slick, I think, is the word that comes to mind. When you look at the original Kamen Rider show, or even the newer ones that are coming out, things are very colorful and they're very comic booky, whereas the first tries to kind of take that tone and rein it in and make it not super grounded, but at least a little more somber and realistic than you were used to with the TV shows. And again, I think that works to its advantage a lot of the time, and occasionally it makes it a little weird, but I also think that's what makes it a really good gateway into Kamen Rider, if you're someone who's not really familiar with like the series or with the tokusatsu genre, because it's a little more subdued. I think if you're someone who's familiar with like westernized superhero movies, it's not as hyper Japanese as your usual Rider stuff, so it might be a little easier to kind of segue into. I know this was actually the first piece of Kamen Rider media I watched, because, you know, when something says the first, you assume you should start there. And that's the kind of intellect you get on movies after midnight. But for me, it was kind of a good transitional piece, because I had been watching a lot of Doctor Who at the time, and I think that level of, like, kind of over-the-top sci-fi, going from that to this movie into, like, the very, like, over-the-top Japanese stuff that you see in the regular Kamen Rider shows, it made it a nice transitional piece. And that's one of the reasons I recommend this film to people, because I think the darker tone makes it a little more... I don't want to paint with too broad a brush again, because I'm reducing, like, you know, cultural differences into like a few sentences here, but basically in America we're very wary of kind of our own, or not even in America, in the West, we're wary of our own kind of tropes and our own ways of doing things, and I think we're always trying to put a spin on it, and where we never want to commit too hard to something, because then it starts to be seen as cheesy, or almost like if you commit too hard, people assume you're disingenuous in a way, because like nobody commits that hard to something. Whereas in Japanese media especially, I think the mentality is very much like, you know, we're doing a superhero movie, let's make it the superhero-iest superhero movie we can possibly do. And I completely lost where I was going with that, actually. With tone. So I think that's the thing that if you're new to Toku that you kind of have to process, is that Japanese media tends to go, if they're doing a horror movie, they go all in with making it as like crazy and shocking as possible. If they're doing a superhero movie, they go all in with making it as like melodramatic and over the top as possible. And that is like I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I think that's what really made me interested in the genre, is because they go there's almost there's a level of earnesty you don't see in Western media a lot, and I feel like I've said that before, but I keep coming back to that. There's just like purity doesn't seem like the right word, but that's there's just something about it that you don't see in Western media, where we're always kind of trying to be subversive and ironic and overanalyzing our own whatever we're doing. And I think this movie still very much does that, but it does it in a more subdued way, so you can kind of like ease your toes into it. And again, with Hongo being a little more, he's a little more. It's again a horrible way to describe it, but the main difference between Showa riders of the 70s and 80s versus Heisei riders of the 2000s onward is that the Heisei riders tend to be a little more pretty boy looking versus like the older riders who were like I said, very these kind of manly seeming dudes, like not like super buff bearded dudes or anything usually, but like it's, I don't know. There's a whole other conversation to be had about like what the ideal male hero became over time. But I think because there's a different idea of what kind of man they want riders to be in this post 2000s era. Having they sort of give Hongo this very almost romantic side to him, where he's got this journalist girl who I can't remember her name, but this was a plot point in the original series that got thrown out a couple episodes in, where she it was her father in the TV show, and then it's her boyfriend that he was sent to assassinate, and it starts snowing, and that reminds him of this conversation he had about the beauty of life and how it's reflected in these water crystals, and it kind of snaps him out of mind control in this very I don't know what to compare that to. Like I want to say it's Kubrickian, but I feel like that insults both this movie and Kubrick at the same time. But like this idea of this kind of like romantic notion of humanity being what saves him rather than any kind of science or anything, and I think that kind of ties into kind of the whole idea of this movie about like what because early Kamen Rider did this, and I think because it was a kids show they didn't get to do it enough, but this movie kind of delves into a little more of a transhumanism thing, even though it does focus on the superheroics, so it doesn't go all out, but it gets into this idea of like he's been made into this cyborg, and on the show you have them lamenting this loss of humanity, and it gets to this point of like, well, what is it that makes them human? And usually they end up kind of it's something deep in their heart, this kind of like human conviction that like causes them to stay human, and that's something that's at the heart of a lot of toku, like even anime like Devilman is I think another example of that, where you have this character who's literally made a deal with the devil and is becoming more demonic every day, but he did it for these very altruistic human reasons, and that humanity is what enables him to have any control at all over this other thing that's sort of taking him over as he fights against it. Because that's another toku theme that you see very strongly in Kamen Rider here is that whole like he who fights monsters may become them kind of thing, where a character is sort of made to be like that which he fights. And again, there's some sort of very very emotional, very human conviction that enables him to hold on to who he was. I actually thought the one example, what it brought to mind was in Flash Gordon, how Zarkov kind of like he resists this mind control by being like, oh, I thought of music, I thought of poetry, I thought of the Beatles, and again, I think that really reflects the kind of the mentality that these movies are made in, where it's not about some really broad, really big nuanced statement. It's about this very simple, very pure, very pure emotional truth that kind of like empowers this character to do whatever they need to do in spite of like it seeming hopeless or what have you. And I think that's where the appeal of stories like this really lie. To get back into the story, the boyfriend that Hongo ends up accidentally killing I forgot to explain that. So she thinks he killed her boyfriend. He snaps out of his mind control, but the monster that's with him kills the guy they were sent after, and she sees him taking off his helmet as he remembers who he was, but she basically sees him standing over her dead boyfriend and is like, oh, well, you killed him then. And so they have this whole arc of like her thinking he's this evil person when he's like the one person fighting against evil. But they resurrect her dead boyfriend as another rider to send after Hongo, and that's when we get into when they get into the relationship between Hongo and Ichimonji. That's when this becomes clear it's a modern rider show. Because with the original series, Ichimonji was kind of where Hongo was this very driven, very sort of rough kind of guy. I want to say like John Wayne is the archetype that comes to mind. There's a whole, we could talk about John Wayne, but that's not the point of this episode. But that's the kind of character Hongo was. Whereas when Ichimonji showed up on the show, he was a little more laid back. I think he was a journalist, which he is in this show too, actually. He was like, he's like a little nicer, a little better with kids, kind of a little more of a chill guy. And in this show, they make him, in this film, they make him a lot more of a kind of self-interested jerk kind of character. It's like the Sasuke Uchida archetype, basically, where you have this kind of self-motivated jerk who like has just enough good in him to come around to the good guys, and that's a very Heisei archetype. And I think if you're a fan of the originals, that's going to be very weird that they took, because I think numbers-wise, Ichimonji actually had more episodes as Rider number 2 than Hongo appeared as Rider number 1. So if you're a character who's partial, or if you're someone who's partial to that character and who like grew up with it, I can only imagine it would be very weird to see him reinterpreted as this kind of like dick, so to speak. But I think that's again this idea of like Hongo sort of inspiring him ultimately to bring out his humanity. And there's this plot about how they both have feelings for Asuka, is this female journalist who they basically send Ichimonji in to use her as bait, basically, to draw Hongo out. But he still, even though he's basically a different person with his new mind and everything, he still has feelings for her. And the two of them kind of end up fighting over her, and he ends up defecting because he's like, yeah, I don't give a crap about you, but, like, I want her alive at the end of all this. And, again, it ties back to this idea of very pure human truths that kind of, like, make us who we are in spite of whatever is done to us or whatever happens to us. And so I think thematically that holds through really well. Also, there was a really nice callback. The way I think the way they show Hongo adapting to his superpowers is nice, because there's a scene that's actually felt like a callback to a similar scene in 85's, was it 85? In Kamen Rider Black, where he gets this beaker. In Black, someone throws him a shot glass, and in this he's like going to get a lab beaker, and he just grabs it and he like crushes it, and is like freaking out because he destroyed this thing with like an ounce of strength and didn't know what to do. And then he ends up, there's this little girl who's like crossing the street, and he jumps out and saves her, and he like leans down and grabs her and pushes his hand out like this, and like you see he leaves a handprint in the front of the truck. And then he's also like, it cuts to him in the hospital, because by saving this girl, he's accidentally, like, when he reached in to protect her, he like crushed her lungs. And you get again, that's when we get back to kind of the transhumanism, is this idea of like he's suddenly become this thing that he doesn't know how to deal with, and he doesn't know how to control. And it actually takes a mentor of his being like, I haven't seen you in a while. You look like a different guy. Just remember that. And they have this conversation about how he's like, yeah, I've been through a lot, without really telling him what's going on. But he's like, just remember, every time you lose something, you also gain something. And I think, again, that goes back to these very simple but very powerful emotional truths of like he's what's happened to him in life has changed who he is, but at the end of the day he gets to decide what he does with that. And it's actually important. This mentor character was Tobei Tachibana, who was a major character in the first several Kamen Rider series. He was a mentor to Hongo, and then after they started kind of doing a new rider each year, he would stay around and be a mentor to them. And he was, I can't remember his name, but he was played by the same actor that was Captain Muda in Ultraman. So he was this one actor who was kind of like this dad figure to a generation of Toku fans. And so fittingly in this remake, he is played by Hiroshi Miyuchi, who was most notably Kamen Rider V3 that came right after these two. That was an alarm. So most notably he played Kamen Rider V3 that came immediately after these two. But he played in several Sentai shows. He was Zubat, not Zubat. He's this actor who's been all over the tokusatsu world, and he kind of V3 is kind of, he's sort of the Tom Baker, I think, in a lot of ways of the Kamen Rider series, where he wasn't the first, but he's this very iconic one that a lot of people grew up with. So having Hiroshi Miyuchi come back and play Tobei Tachibana, it's this nice sort of nod to the past, and sort of like the past coming back to pat the present on the shoulder and usher it forward. And again, having him deliver that message about who you are and everything, that was a really cool touch for fans of the genre. I do want to talk about. As far as where things kind of go, yeah, ultimately, so you have, without spoiling too much, you have this plot about Ichimonji and Hongo, kind of like Ichimonji first hunting him down and then like coming around, and they both sort of end up putting aside their differences to protect the woman they love. And you have throughout this, you have this subplot of these two kids who are sort of terminally ill in this hospital, or one of them is, and he meets this girl who's also in the hospital, and she kind of like teaches, like he's got no one's visiting him, no one cares about him, and and he's like, well, what's the point in living, because even if I get out of here, I've got no one. And she sort of like comes to him and takes care of him and gives him this motivation to live. And at first it's a weird subplot because you're like, this has nothing to do with anything really. But eventually, as they start getting more and more frequent, the sort of Shocker is the name of the bad guys in this. I think it stands for Sacred Hegemony of Cycle Evolutionary Kind. Psycho Kindred Evolutionary Race or something like that. It's Japanese trying to do Japanese language trying to do English acronyms, yeah. But they're basically this kind of like in the original show they went into the Shocker actually being like a Nazi splinter cell, like basically Hydra. They don't go into that as much in this film, but that's their backstory. But basically, this Shocker guy shows up when they capture Hongo, and that same man shows up to the hospital and is like, "Oh, I found a way to," because it turns out the girl is terminal, and the boy didn't know that, and the Shocker guy shows up and he's like, "Oh, I have a way to make you better," and then you realize what's going to happen to these two kids. And then shortly after that, it cuts forward and reveals that subplot was all flashback, and that's the backstory of these two snake people that are working for Shocker that show up around this time. And when you have them defeated, when they're defeated by the two riders, the boy sees these flowers he planted earlier in the story, and that kind of makes him remember who he was, and so those two are together, like, kind of remember who they are right as they die, and it's this weirdly tragic thing that, I guess it does kind of go back to the idea of like this, whatever happens to you, there's still this emotional core of who you are, and you have the choice to embrace that or not. And I think they're presented there as kind of the counterpoint where Hongo was able to be reminded of that and get away in time. These are people who were sort of didn't have that opportunity. And it's interesting. Like, I think it, again, like, you could probably take that out of the film and it wouldn't hurt it that much, but I also don't think the film is hurt by having that subplot there. It's really interesting. And talking about the writing, a lot of what there were only a few things I didn't like about this movie, but all of my feelings on it were clarified when I realized that it was written by Toshiki Inoue, who, if you're a Kamen Rider fan, you've probably heard his name before. He's been a writer in the Toku world for practically ever. Like, I don't know, practically ever. Like, he's been writing since the late 80s, early 90s. His most probably well-known or well-received work was he wrote scripts for Jetman, which is one of the 90s Sentai shows, which is available to watch on Tokushoutsu, on Shout Factory's streaming service. So if you're interested in that, definitely check out Jetman. He also wrote Kamen Rider 555, or Fives, because he's called Fives, and it's an acronym. He wrote Kamen Rider Fives, and he wrote Kamen Rider Kiva, and I know he's written a few more other than that, but when you've seen a few of those shows, you notice Inoue has he has a bag of tricks that he likes to use in everything he writes, and one of them being, like, this guy who you're supposed to like but is kind of a dick and you're not sure why you're supposed to like him, and you kind of see that in Ichimonji here, although he's not the worst. I can't remember his name, but there's a character in Fies who, like, is literally, like, I have never disliked a fictional character more than that guy, but that's a whole other thing. And ironically, Fies and Kiva are, like, two of my favorite riders. Yes, Kiva is one of my favorite riders, don't at me. But another thing Inoue does is poor communication as plot development, and that's maybe the one thing about his writing style that I really don't like. Because, again, like, I've liked most of the things he's written, and that really comes through in the Asuka subplot, where she's literally investigating Shocker and, like, trying to find out what happened. So, like, if anyone would understand what happened to Hongo, it would be her. And he's like, oh, no, I didn't tell you what was going on because I thought you needed someone to be angry at. And, like, it almost makes sense, but it's also just, like, yet another, like, and he did this in Fies too, where there's the main character has so many moments where he just, like, literally 2 seconds of, like, oh, this is why X happened would have solved, like, at least 5 episodes of plot. But again, that's one thing, and in this film they don't, like, waste lots of time on that conflict, so it's not ultimately a big deal. And so ultimately, I do think, like, the message kind of comes through, and I do think this is a fairly solid example of one of his works. What else do we have to talk about? The fight choreography is good. It's Heisei choreography, where Showa was very martial arts heavy, and Heisei is a little more about the explosions and the superpowers. But I think it does work, ultimately. And you can tell I know some of the fight choreography people on this also ended up working on some Power Rangers stuff over here. And that's actually an interesting thing about this movie, is because it was produced by the same people who've been producing Kamen Rider shows year after year, it's a lot more homogenous with the stuff that it's inspired by than like a Marvel movie is by a Marvel comic. And that was really interesting. But there's a scene in one of the final fights that there's a shot that almost exactly resembles a shot from the Power Rangers episode Forever Red. There's, like, a final fight in that. And I'm pretty sure that's because some of the same people were like choreographing these fights. But yeah, I think the fight choreography was good. The writing was good. The writing does get, I think, because of that very like emotional focus, it starts to get kind of soap opera-y, especially with the either the hospital kids or the Asuka subplots, where you get these focuses on something that's very romantic. It starts to feel very kind of like J-drama soap opera. But again, I think because of the heightened emotional focus, I think that works, and I think it sort of makes the hype. It sort of helps earn the over the top superhero action in a way. I think ultimately. It is like Asuka ultimately, as important as she is to the plot, she ultimately doesn't feel that important to the plot, and that's not an uncommon thing with like female love interests, and especially with Kamen Rider is at the end of the day a show and a franchise that's targeted at boys, so they don't always focus on their female characters, but like because that's like it's really like she's a device to focus on the relationship between the two guys. I feel like at some on some level, and so that's one criticism. But even like again, I think Japan and the Kamen Rider franchise are just at a different place as far as like dealing with that, and this was from 2005, so like even then like they weren't where they are now. But yeah, it's a thing to criticize, but again, it's not glaring enough that it's going to ruin the movie for you. Kamen Rider knows who it's for, and that is for the most part like 13 to 20 something boys and me, I guess, too. But yeah, overall, I think because of that like sort of hype, it stays true to the very emotional core of what Kamen Rider is, despite being a more darker, subdued film. And I think because of that, it's a really good introduction into the world of Kamen Rider. And so that's kind of why I wanted to talk about the first. It's not the best Kamen Rider thing. Again, if you're looking to get into the shows, I would recommend the original show is again on Shout Factory. If you're in the States, their streaming service has all those episodes up for free. Otherwise, you could find there are fan dubs of most Rider series out there. Some of the ones I like, Kamen Rider Black in tone. It was the last one before they went on, second to last one before they went on hiatus. Black RX is a lot more campy than Black, and I think this film pulls a lot from Black in terms of having kind of a darker tone. And sorry, I got distracted by the movie. It pulls from Black a lot in terms of its tone and its style, where you have this very dark, sort of darker, gritty, like notion of how things work but still having this very comic booky, emotionally concentrated core. And so I think if you like this, I think Black is something you should definitely check out. If you're looking for newer riders, I've said in 2011 they did Kamen Rider Double, and then O's, and then Fours, and I think those are three of the best. And I would almost just recommend O's or Fours, but the thing is, like, they're all really good, but each one is so good that it kind of like makes you realize how much better it is than the one that came before. So I'd like any of those. If you're looking to get into Kamen Rider, I think I could recommend the Double O's Fours trilogy. And if you're not feeling it by the time you get into like middle of O's, then maybe then you're probably not going to feel it. But I think they're all really good examples of everything I've kind of discussed with this movie, just applied to a more concentrated action, extended toy commercial format. But again, I think that's something else that I like about Kamen Rider. It is at the end of the day a big toy commercial, and they don't have to do what they do with these stories, but they kind of keep doing it. And I think that they find the opportunity to tell these really cool stories about humanity and about motivation and about sort of like very deep personal truths in something that's ultimately was just designed to sell action figures is really cool. And I don't know, something we could learn something from, I think, over here in our very merchandise heavy culture. So yeah, Kamen Rider. Kamen Riders are cool. Where I lost my rider. Oh no. There he is. Thanks for watching. We will continue TokuTember with hopefully some kaiju soon, because you can't really talk about Toku without talking about kaijus. So, thank you for watching. I hope this piqued your interest. Again, please talk to the podcast on our Twitter page, our Facebook page. I'll be there to respond to either of those. Leave comments if you liked this. If you didn't, let us know how we're doing. Thanks for joining us, and I will see you again next time. Bye bye.